social science finding, it's pretty damn self-evident, right? Smart people who work hard do better. But what's also really cool about that, and it isn't viewed this way very often, is like, let's say that you were going to psychometrically validate the integrity of an economic system. So you'd say, well, you take the smart people and the hardworking people and see if they do better, and if the answer is no, then this system is rotten, right? I mean, doesn't that make sense? Because you'd hope if a system is functioning, that faster, harder working people would be better at whatever it does. And it turns out that in our culture, in the Western culture, the correlation between conscientiousness plus IQ, you have to weight the two, and long-term life success is as high as 0.7, which is walloping correlation, given how much chance also contributes to success, right? Because you can be working hard and very smart, and then you get cancer and die, and that's the end of that. Like, there are lots of random events in life that interfere with your movement forward. And so there's an ineradicable degree of chance that prediction is not going to overcome. Plus, we're not that good at measuring success, so there's error on the success end of the measurement as well. But IQ and conscientiousness go a long ways.
Yeah.
So, and that's competence. You know, and
Correct.
then the other thing we might think about with regards to defining a competence hierarchy is, imagine that one of the things you want from the operators within a hierarchy is that they maintain the hierarchy and they expand it so that it can include other people, right? And so competence, a good measure of competence would be the ability to work within the hierarchy while you're also maintaining it and expanding it. And so that means that you would want to set up an economic system where smart, hardworking people were doing things that made other people who weren't them rich too. And I think we're actually pretty good at that. You know, if you look at the statistics, here's a good one. And this is why people shouldn't be as pessimistic as they are, likely.
It's a good feeling to make other people well off and have their well-being be better.
Lots of people. I mean, one of the things I've really been struck by with the people that I've known who are hyper-competent is that one of the things they really like to do is to find young people who need opportunities and open doors for them. I mean, it's a pleasure that's not well measured, you know, but I know that, like, I've seen that among the professors that I've known that I really admired. Like, they really like to mentor graduate schools and graduate students and develop their careers, and entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley that I know the same thing. And good managers and administrators, they're not playing a zero-sum game. Like, they're not opening the doors to everyone, I wouldn't say, but they're definitely always looking around for competent people who are young to provide opportunities to. And it's a real unsung virtue of capitalism that sort of thing occurs. And it's not rare. So back to the IQ and conscientiousness connection is like with regards to the broad capitalist social and economic structure. You know, I don't know if you guys know this, but the UN set as one of its millennial goals in the year 2000 to have the rates of poverty in the world by 50% within 15 years, right? And we hit that in 2012, 3 years ahead of schedule. It was the fastest decrease in human poverty that has ever occurred in the history of the planet by a massive margin. And it hasn't quit. Now, obesity is a bigger problem now than starvation. It's like, we should have party in the street for that, right? There's more fat people than there are starving people. You know, it's a perverse sort of victory, but it's a big one. And about 300,000 people a day right now are being plugged into the electrical grid, and the fastest growing economies are in sub-Saharan Africa. It's like, there's some real reason to be thinking things are going great.
And they're having Amazon and Alibaba compete to provide them with those goods that they need every single day.
Yeah, well, they have cell phone technology that's really made a big difference and helped stabilize the currencies and help them identify where the proper market is for their goods. And so competence hierarchies. It's better to think.
Yeah.
It's better to think of a well-functioning human hierarchy as one based on competence. The other thing my colleague said to me was that you don't want to overestimate how much power people have, let's say, in a corporate environment, because it's not obvious at all that the managers, or the executives for that matter, except in the rare cases where they're psychopathic, have fewer strictures. Well, sometimes you get psychopaths that rise to the top, right? I mean, otherwise there wouldn't be psychopaths. But it isn't obvious that people higher up in a competence hierarchy have fewer strictures on their moral behavior than people lower in the hierarchy, right? Because my sense is that responsibility increases as you move up the hierarchy, and so And your degrees of freedom with regards to moral latitude also tend to decline. Because if you're a manager of people,
Definitely.
maybe you have 30 people working for you and they each only have one manager. There's a lot of people that you're responsible to. And you can't mistreat your people with any degree of consistency, because the good ones leave, the bad ones torture you to death, and the whole thing collapses across time. And so the whole idea that what you have in a competence hierarchy is power is not a reasonable assumption as far as I can tell. That's a big deal, right?
Absolutely.
Like, we really got to get that right. One of the things that I've found very interesting about looking at archetypal representations of experiential reality is that they're always balanced. And so the fundamental archetypal representation of the hierarchy is the wise king and the tyrant. And every hierarchy can be reasonably represented with narratives involving the wise king and the tyrant. So the wise king is the part of the hierarchy that sustains itself and expands and includes more people, right? So that's a functioning polity. And the tyrant is the fact that people operating within that hierarchy can play zero-sum games, can be willfully blind, can be malevolent, can play politics, can cease to be productive, can manipulate the system for their own devices, and all of that. And it's obviously the case that every human institution, especially as they scale, falls prey to the tyrannical part of the archetype. That's why big things fall apart.
Yeah.
And so when you say, well, to what degree is a hierarchy To what degree does a hierarchy emerge because of tyrannical factors? The answer is, well, it depends on the hierarchy, but generally a non-trivial amount that scales with size.
Okay.
But that, having said that, that doesn't, to say that something is partially corrupt is a lot different than saying that it's totally corrupt, right? You don't get a hierarchy without getting a tyranny along with it, you know, but there's a hell of a difference between the 30 or so countries in the world where anyone with any sense would want to live, and the other 150 that are basically run by barbaric thugs. And it's important to keep the distinction between those two things in mind. It's like, yeah, we've got some things that we should put together and clean up, and you know, people are discriminated against for unfair reasons, and that's to everyone's detriment, obviously. But it's a multivariate problem, and the positioning of someone in a hierarchy of competence is in part due to their, what would you say, to the historical context within which that hierarchy has emerged. But to say it's all a consequence of that is part of what I regard as the radical leftist war on the idea of competence itself. Because I actually think that's the fundamental narrative driving the real radical leftists, is that they hate the idea of competence itself. It's deeper than Orwell's comment, George Orwell's comment in Road to Wigan Pier, where he said, well, the problem with middle-class British socialists is that they don't like the poor, they just hate the rich, which is like dead on, man, vicious diagnosis. It's worse than that, is that the radical leftists don't like the oppressed, they just hate the competent. I really believe that. I think it's unbelievably pathological and dangerous. And this is worth thinking about too, and this is part of the Pareto distribution problem, is that success is disproportionately rewarded. It's not linear. So as you start to succeed, each success non-linearly increases the probability of the next success, right? So
the doors open.
Yeah, that's right. And not one door, but they open exponentially. Right, exactly. And as you fail, they close exponentially. So you might think, well, failure, success, linear. It's like, no. Failure, success, right? So once you start to fail, good luck to you, right? Because each failure increases the probability of the next failure in a nonlinear fashion. And that really, if you're on a downhill trend, man, that's really vicious. And it's hard to get out of it. You see that happen to big companies when they start to go into a death spiral. They can't pull themselves out of it. But by the same token, when you start to succeed, each success increases the probability of the next one. You actually even see that with lobsters. So back to the crustaceans. Well, it's so interesting that some of these things are so fundamental that they appear so low in the phylogenetic chain. So if you tally up, you watch a lobster engage in sequential dominance disputes, so basically physical challenges. his probability, if he loses a battle, the probability that he'll lose the next battle is higher than you would expect if you just derived a linear function that was a consequence of the tally of his previous victories and losses. So because he's lost, he's more likely to lose harder the next time. But if he wins, he's statistically more likely to win. So, and that also drives, well, that's a fundamental issue too. That drives the disproportionate distribution of productive goods and material resources, which is a very big problem. It's another thing we need to have an intelligent discussion about. And this is why we have to have an intelligent discussion about this, because on the one hand, it's pretty obvious that modern economies are doing a damn good job of lifting people rapidly out of abject poverty. Okay, but at the same time, the inequality of economic inequality, by some measures at least, is increasing. And that does have this destabilizing effect. And so then the question is, what do you do about it? Well, it's really hard, because in a meritocracy, part of that's driven by segregation by intelligence. And then that's likely exaggerated by the provision of computational power, because a really smart person with a computer is way smarter than a really smart person without a computer, and is way smarter than a person who isn't so smart, either with or without a computer. Right? So the computational technology looks like it's a multiplier, like I'm sure many of you already know. Because there's a huge difference between someone who can really use a computer and someone who's barely computer literate. And way more people are barely computer literate than you know. Measuring success is not an easy thing.
You think it should be meritocracy no matter what, period?
No, there's always a fly in the ointment.
Fly in the ointment.
Well,
okay.
there is. So the other thing, there's a good book that I would recommend reading called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. It's a new book, relatively new book. And he details out the ineradicability of inequality. So part of the problem with this process that we just described, where success breeds success and failure breeds failure, is that the people who are succeeding get a disproportionate share of the resource pie, let's say. So everyone knows that about money, right? Because the 12 richest people in the world, the 85 richest people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2 billion, which seems, well, let's say unfair. Now, it's certainly unequal. Now, whether it's unfair is slightly
Jordan,
different.
The statistic is the eight richest have equal to the bottom 3.5 billion.
Yeah, well, it's probably worse than it was when I looked at this about 3 years ago. So, but it doesn't matter, because you get the point. But
it's crazy.
But the thing is that this is not something that only applies to money. It applies to everything that's creatively produced. So the same rule applies to number of records sold by recording artists. The same rule applies to number of books sold by novelists. The same rule applies to number of goals scored by NHL hockey players. The same rule applies to the population of cities and the mass of stars and the size of trees in the jungle. It's like the inequality problem is way more troublesome, again, than mere capitalism. It's a terrible problem. And Scheidel's work, which is really, really interesting, he's traced back inequality 15,000 years. You can do it, for example, let's say you find a Neolithic burial site and there's 200 people in it. So these people would be buried with their possessions. And obviously some of them decay, but some of them don't. And like some of them are buried with gold. Well, hardly any of them. And the tiny proportion of people who are buried with gold are buried with a lot of gold. So you can even derive a Gini coefficient estimate, which is an estimate of inequality from burial sites. And it looks like as soon as you get a surplus, you get inequality. And that's a rough thing, because you might think, well, even in hunter-gatherer societies where there's no surplus, there's still inequality, because there's inequality of friendship, there's inequality of health, and there's inequality of sexual access. And those things are not trivial. But when you're thinking about it purely economically, you start to get inequality as soon as you get a surplus. You think, oh, that's interesting. So there's a natural rule, which is surplus generates inequality. All right, so how do you solve that? And Scheidel's book says, well, that's easy. You just get rid of the surplus. Right, and that's not good. So like he found, and so one of the things he did was statistical analysis, because one of the things you might ask is, well, let's say you have your measures of inequality, and then you can track them around the world, and you can track whether or not the inequality is generated by a right-wing government or a left-wing government. And then you might hope, well, the left-wing governments would ameliorate inequality. There's no evidence for that at all. It doesn't look like inequality is it doesn't look like the amelioration of inequality is within the purview of political organization. Yeah. And you should not hear that with any degree of happiness whatsoever, because the social science on inequality is also clear. As inequality levels increase, societies destabilize. And the best indicator of that, I already mentioned that was work that was done by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson at McMaster University in Canada. They're really interested in what drove male homicide, because most homicide is male on male. It's mostly young males. It's mostly within race. And it's mostly status competition, right? So, and the status competitions get intense where inequality increases. So where everyone's poor, so if you rank order American states and Canadian provinces by inequality, the poorer provinces where everyone's poor, there's no male aggression. And the rich provinces and states where everyone's rich, there's no male homicide. But the states and provinces where inequality is high, the male homicide rate starts to climb up. And it's probably the most aggressive males who get most aggressive most rapidly when inequality increases. So there's a psychological component, but inequality drives male homicide. 0.9 is the correlation, which means that you actually don't need any other explanation for male homicide. Maybe you throw in alcohol just as an extraneous variable. You don't need any other explanation for the male homicide rate than inequality. It's staggering work. It's absolutely staggering work. And so the thing is that a meritocracy will drive inequality. And then you have a problem because people stack up at zero and they can't get out of zero, because that's what happens as inequality increases. People think about when you're playing Monopoly, the game. I mean, that's a perfect example of how inequality emerges. Everybody's equal to begin with. Everybody basically plays a random game, because Monopoly is basically a random game. I mean, there's some skill in it, but not much. So it's a random game. So what happens when everyone starts equal and you play a random game? One person ends up with everything. Everyone else stacks up at zero. Now, Scheidell's book basically shows the only way out of that is various forms of war, including revolution, and epidemics. That's it. That's the only thing he's been able to track. And what happens is, well, you level everyone, and then inequality decreases. It's like, well, okay. Like, that doesn't seem like a really great solution. So one of the most terrifying statistics I ever came across was one detailing out the rationale of the United States Armed Forces for not allowing you can't induct anyone into the armed forces in the US if they have an IQ of less than 83. Okay, so let's just take that apart for a minute, because it's a horrifying thing. So the US Armed Forces has been in the forefront of intelligence research since World War I, because they were on board early with the idea that, especially during wartime, when you're ramping up quickly, that you need to sort people effectively and essentially without prejudice, so that you can build up the officer corps so you don't lose the damn war. Okay, so there's real motivation to get it right? Because it's a life and death issue. So they used IQ. They did a lot of the early psychometric work on IQ. Okay, so that's the first thing. They're motivated to find an accurate predictor, so they settle on IQ. The second thing was the United States Armed Forces is also really motivated to get people into the armed forces, peacetime or wartime. Wartime, well, for obvious reasons. Peacetime, because, well, first of all, you got to keep the armed forces going. And second, you can use the armed forces during peacetime as a way of taking people out of the underclass and moving them up into the working class or the middle class, right? You can use it as a training mechanism. And so and left and right can agree on that. It's a reasonable way of promoting social mobility. So again, the armed forces, even in peacetime, is very motivated to get as many people in as they possibly can. And it's difficult as well. It's not that easy to recruit people, so you don't want to throw people out if you don't have to. So what's the upshot of all that? Well, after 100 years, essentially, of careful statistical analysis, the armed forces concluded that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there wasn't anything you could possibly be trained to do in the military at any level of the organization that wasn't positively counterproductive. Okay, you think, well, so what? 83, okay. Yeah, 1 in 10. 1 in 10. That's 1 in 10 people. And what that really means, that as far as I can tell, is if you imagine that the military is approximately as complex as the broader society, which I think is a reasonable proposition, then there's no place in our cognitively complex society for 1 in 10 people. So what are we going to do about that? The answer is no one knows. You say, well, shovel money down the hierarchy. It's like, the problem isn't lack of money. I mean, sometimes that's the problem, but the problem is rarely absolute poverty. It's rarely that. It is sometimes, but rarely. It's not that easy to move money down the hierarchy. So, first of all, it's not that easy to manage money. So, it's a vicious problem, man. The liberals think everyone's roughly equal and there's a job for everyone, you just have to train them. It's like, no, wrong. And the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone if they just get off their ass and work. It's like, no, that's wrong too. Even though if you work, that's better. And, well, so that's on the conservative end, but the liberals won't take into account individual differences. Well, obviously, that's part of what the whole politically correct discussion is about. It's like, everyone's the same. It's like, yeah, they're not. So if you have to have unequal distribution, then a meritocracy is probably the best way to do it. But it still leaves you with this terrible problem, which is, what do you do with all the people who stack up at zero? And the answer isn't have contempt for them because they don't work as hard as you. It's like, yeah, a bunch of them don't. Because conscientiousness also predicts success. So among the poor, there are people who don't work, but you never want to underestimate the contribution of cognitive ability. So it's rough, man, and we don't take it seriously, and we don't know what to do about it. And it's clear that as inequality increases, societies destabilize. That's clear. So it's something that has to be dealt with, but we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to efficiently move resources to the bottom end of the competence hierarchy so that things don't destabilize.